Picture this. You're hiking alone in the heart of the Appalachians, the fog thick around you, and suddenly you hear chanting, low, rhythmic, and utterly unnatural, coming from a clearing you weren't supposed to find. Tonight, I'm taking you into real encounters with hidden rituals, moments where curiosity almost got people trapped in something far darker than they ever imagined. These stories are chilling, true, and will make you question every shadow in the woods. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and share this with anyone brave enough to hear it. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Now, hold on tight. This is going to get unsettling. I remember the first time I realized the woods could feel alive in a way that wasn't comforting. It was late October, the kind of evening where the air carries a bite that cuts through even the thickest jacket, and the sun dips early, leaving the hills cloaked in a gray, trembling light. I'd been following a narrow dirt road, the sort that squeezes between two ridges, the edges blurred by overgrown brush and fallen leaf. Every step I took seemed to amplify the silence. There was no wind in the treetops, no bird song, just the faint crunch of my boots on the frost-stiffened earth. I'd wandered this section of Appalachia before, but that day, something about the woods felt different, as though they were holding their breath, waiting for me to make a wrong turn. I was moving slowly, eyes flicking over the skeletal branches, when a faint orange glow caught my attention. It wasn't far, just beyond the curve of the road in a small clearing, but it seemed unnatural, almost alive. My curiosity pulled me forward, despite a growing knot of unease in my stomach. The dirt road was swallowed by shadows as I stepped off it, leaves and twigs crunching underfoot, each sound sounding far louder than it had any right to. The closer I got, the more I realized the glow wasn't a campfire like the ones I'd seen from hikers. The flames leapt higher than they should have, burning with a color that made the surrounding trees seem blacker, deeper, as though the fire was drawing light into itself. Then I saw them, a circle of figures, huddled close around the fire, their heads covered in rough hooded cloaks. They were chanting, low and guttural, words that didn't belong in any language I knew. The sound wasn't just audible. It pressed against my chest, vibrating through my rib cage and lungs, clawing at something deeper, something primal. I froze where I stood, trying to make myself small, hoping they wouldn't notice me. I didn't even dare breathe, my lungs tight, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might tear through my chest. The firelight flickered across their faces, or where their faces should have been. Shadow swallowed them entirely. I wanted to turn back quietly, to slip away unnoticed, but the woods had a cruel sense of timing. A single twig snapped under my boot. It was a small sound, almost nothing, but it was enough. Heads snapped toward me in unison, the movement eerily synchronized, like some hidden signal had been triggered. Their eyes caught the firelight, glinting sharp and cold. I can still see it in my mind, the way they stared, unblinking, unmoving, until my legs no longer obeyed thought. That's when pure, elemental fear took over, the kind that roots you to the spot, freezes you mid-breath, and whispers that your life might hinge on a single decision. I turned and ran. There was no strategy, no plan, just the desperate instinct to put distance between myself and the fire. Branches whipped my face, clawed at my arms, tore my jacket, but I didn't care. My lungs burned, my legs ached, every sense screaming in survival mode. The chanting followed me though. Even as the fire disappeared from sight, the words, low and insistent, echoed in my mind. They weren't loud anymore, but the rhythm was persistent, like a pulse that refused to let me forget. Every time I slowed, even for a moment, the echoes seemed to grow, as though the fire itself were chasing me, wrapping the woods around me in some unseen coil. I stumbled for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, until the trees thinned and I burst onto the main road. Street lights from a nearby highway, or maybe just the fading remnants of dusk, spilled across the asphalt. I didn't stop running until my lungs burned with every breath. And even then, when I finally collapsed into my car, hands shaking, knees bruised, I could still hear it, the hollow, guttural chanting, impossibly far, but impossibly near. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, some overactive imagination fueled by isolation and fatigue. I told a few friends what I'd seen, and the polite skepticism they offered felt like a lifeline, a tether to normalcy. But I knew the truth. I'd glimpsed something in those woods that didn't belong to the daylight world, something human yet utterly alien. It wasn't a story to tell around a campfire. It was a warning. Since that night, I've avoided that ridge entirely. I've driven past the turnoffs dozens of times, heart thumping, hands gripping the wheel like the forest itself might reach out and drag me back. But sometimes, even in the comfort of my home, I hear it. Not out the window, not from the trees behind the house, but deep in the quiet of the evening, a rhythmic, low hum that lingers in the spaces between thought. I can't explain it. I tell myself it's the wind, or the pipes settling, or some subconscious echo of memory. But every instinct in me knows it's the same sound I heard that night, the same chant that pressed against my chest and forced my legs to run without hesitation. The woods in Appalachia have always been dense, mysterious, full of stories whispered across generations. I grew up hearing them, lost hikers, strange disappearances, old cabins that seemed empty but weren't. I never believed them until that October night. The chants didn't belong to the kind of stories people tell with a laugh and a shiver. They belonged to something that didn't need our understanding to exist, and somehow I had been close enough to touch it. I sometimes wonder if I'll ever walk that ridge again. Part of me wants to, just to prove to myself it was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. But another, larger part of me knows that some things aren't meant to be confirmed. They exist on the edges of our perception, glimpsed in a firelight glow or the snap of a twig, waiting for the unwary. There's a hollow in those woods where I lost more than just my sense of safety. I lost certainty. I lost the belief that the world was fully knowable. Even now, years later, I can't drive past that turn without my chest tightening. I can't hike alone without listening for the faintest echo of chanting. And sometimes, in the dead hours of the night, when the wind rattles the window panes just right, I swear I hear it. The low, guttural rhythm, like the earth itself is murmuring words I'm not meant to understand. It's a reminder that some corners of Appalachia are alive in ways that don't care about us, that there are fires burning where no one is meant to watch, and that curiosity can be far more dangerous than any predator lurking in the shadows. I don't know who or what they were. I don't know if anyone else has seen them. I don't even know if I want to. But the memory isn't mine to control. It clings to me, a shadow at the edge of every quiet walk, every lonely evening, a rhythm that reminds me how close I came to something older, darker, and utterly indifferent to my survival. That night, the forest taught me something no story, no legend, no warning ever could. Sometimes, fear doesn't need a face. Sometimes it's just there, in the rhythm of chanting, in the unnatural glow of fire, in the sudden snap of a twig, and in the echo that follows you long after you've escaped. I still hear it sometimes. And every time I remember exactly how alone I was, exactly how powerless I felt, and exactly how close I came to vanishing entirely into the hollow, endless night of those mountains. I camped on Old Ridge because I wanted to be alone in a way that felt clean and honest. Life had been loud for too long, and the idea of isolation sounded like relief. Old Ridge sits high above a narrow valley. The kind of place locals don't talk about much unless pressed, and even then they keep their voices low. I'd heard it was quiet up there, untouched. That's what sold me. I parked my truck just before dusk and hiked the rest of the way in, the trail thinning until it was little more than a suggestion through dead leaves and stone. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps and the slow creak of my pack straps. By the time I reached a flat spot suitable for a tent, the sky had begun to darken. I remember noticing the moon early, too early. It was rising already, swollen and tinted a deep, unsettling red, like light seen through blood. I told myself it was just a harvest moon, some trick of atmosphere and dust. Still, it made the valley below look wrong, washed in a crimson haze that flattened shadows and made distance hard to judge. I pitched my tent quickly, feeling an irrational urge to get it done before full dark, as if something was watching and waiting for me to settle in. Night came fast on the ridge. The temperature dropped sharply, and the silence grew heavier, pressing in on my ears until I caught myself holding my breath just to hear something, anything, besides my own pulse. I cooked a simple meal, ate without much appetite, and crawled into my tent early. That's when I first heard the movement. At first it was so faint I thought it was my imagination. A soft, deliberate crunch of leaves, spaced too evenly to be an animal. It circled the tent slowly, methodically, never rushing, never stopping long enough for me to pinpoint exactly where it was. I lay there, frozen, heart pounding, listening. The footsteps multiplied. Not loud, never loud, but unmistakably human. I told myself it was other campers, maybe a group hiking late, though I hadn't passed a single car or soul on the way up. Eventually, I forced myself to lean forward and peel back the tent flap just enough to look out. What I saw drained every rational thought from my mind. Figures moved at the edge of my camp, half lit by the red moon. There were several of them, how many I couldn't tell, dressed in dark, shapeless clothing that blended too well with the trees. They moved in a strange, synchronized way, each step measured, each turn mirrored, like they were following a rhythm I couldn't hear. In their hands were candles, their flames small but steady despite the open air, and odd tools I couldn't identify. Long, narrow shapes that caught the moonlight dully, like old metal or bone. They stopped moving all at once. Every one of them turned their head toward my tent. I couldn't see faces clearly, but I knew they were looking directly at me. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. It felt intentional, heavy, like a held breath stretched too long. I remember thinking, absurdly, that if they'd spoken or shouted, I might have screamed or run. But they didn't. They just stood there, candles flickering, as if acknowledging that I was awake and aware. I pulled back into the tent, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip my knees to steady myself. I told myself it had to be a nightmare, that exhaustion and isolation were playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it again. The unmistakable crunch of leaves under slow, careful feet. Real sound. Real weight. My instincts screamed at me to flee, to tear out of the tent and run for the trail. But Old Ridge is narrow, the drop on either side steep and unforgiving. One wrong step in the dark, and there'd be no second chances. So I stayed. I curled into myself, barely daring to breathe as the hours stretched on. The figures resumed moving, no longer circling the tent, but spreading out across the ridge. I heard whispered voices, low and overlapping, speaking names I didn't recognize. The cadence was wrong, the syllables dragging and folding in on themselves. Somewhere nearby, a low drum began to sound. Not loud, just a steady, dull thump that vibrated faintly through the ground and into my chest. Each beat made my head feel light, unfocused, like I'd stood up too fast. The smell came next. Burning herbs, thick and sweet and bitter all at once. It seeped through the tent fabric, clung to my clothes, filled my lungs until every breath made me dizzy. My thoughts began to slip, edges blurring, fear mixing with a strange sense of detachment. I had the unsettling impression that the ritual, because that's the only word that fits, wasn't for me specifically. I was just there, a witness. Or worse, an ingredient they hadn't planned on but were willing to accept. Time lost meaning. I don't know how long it went on. I remember staring at the faint outline of the tent wall, watching shadows move across it in patterns that never quite repeated. Sometimes the whispers grew closer, sometimes farther away. At one point, I was certain someone stopped right outside my tent. I could hear their breathing, slow and steady, as if they were listening to me, listen to them. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed they wouldn't unzip the flap, that whatever rules governed their actions would keep me unseen and untouched. Eventually, the drums stopped. The whispers faded, one by one, until there was nothing but the faint crackle of dying candle flames and the night sounds slowly returning. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through high branches. I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was, muscles aching, fear still coiled tight in my gut, until the first gray hint of dawn crept into the sky. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the ridge was empty. No figures. No candles. Just trampled ground where the ritual had taken place, leaves crushed into the dirt, dark smudges I didn't want to inspect too closely. The air still carried a faint trace of that herbal smoke, enough to make my stomach churn. I packed up in silence, hands numb, every sound making me flinch. I didn't hike out slowly. I moved as fast as the terrain allowed, not stopping until I reached my truck and slammed the door shut behind me. Even then, I sat there for a long time, forehead against the steering wheel, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was over. But it doesn't feel over. Sometimes, late at night, when the moon hangs low and red over the horizon, I smell those herbs again, faint but unmistakable. I remember the way they stood and looked at me, the way the silence felt deliberate. Old Ridge took something from me that night, my belief that isolation is always peaceful, that the wilderness is empty when we aren't looking. I don't camp anymore, and I don't go anywhere near narrow ridges, because I know now that some places don't need you to participate. They just need you to be there. I found the cabin by accident, the way you find things in the woods when you stop paying attention to where you're supposed to be. I'd been hiking for most of the day, following an old logging trail that thinned into nothing but flattened leaves and broken branches. My map said there was nothing out there for miles, just dense forest and uneven terrain, which was exactly why I went. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel small in a way that didn't hurt. The woods were thick, the kind that swallows sound, and by late afternoon, the light filtered down in narrow, dusty beams that made everything feel older than it should have. That's when I saw it. The cabin sat in a shallow hollow between trees, so dark it almost blended into the shadows. The walls were blackened, not from a recent fire, but from years, maybe decades of exposure, rot, and something else I couldn't quite name. The windows were clouded with grime so thick they reflected light instead of letting it through. No smoke, no path leading to it. Just a structure that felt dropped into place rather than built. My first thought was that it had been abandoned a long time ago, forgotten the way so many things in Appalachia are. I shouldn't have gone closer. I know that now, but curiosity has a weight to it, especially when you're alone. As I approached, the air around the cabin felt colder, heavier, like stepping into a basement that hasn't been opened in years. The door frame caught my eye next. Symbols were etched into the wood, crude and uneven, as if carved with something dull. They weren't decorative. They didn't look like letters or any language I recognized. The marks felt deliberate but rushed, layered over one another like whoever made them kept changing their mind or correcting mistakes. I ran my fingers close to them without touching, feeling an instinctive pull to pull my hand back. There were no signs of life, no footsteps, no sound from inside. I told myself it was just an old hunting cabin, maybe something left behind by people who didn't want to be found. Still, I didn't go in. Something about the place made my chest tighten, like I was already intruding. I backed away and made camp a short distance off, far enough to feel separate but close enough that the cabin stayed in the corner of my vision until darkness swallowed it. That night, the woods were wrong. I can't explain it better than that. The usual sounds, crickets, wind through leaves, distant animals, never fully came. Instead, there was a low, hollow quiet that made every small noise feel amplified. I just started drifting towards sleep when I heard it. Chanting. Faint, almost indistinguishable at first, like a rhythm carried through the ground rather than the air. It took me a few seconds to realize where it was coming from. The cabin. My heart started pounding so hard, I thought it might give me away, even from that distance. The chanting wasn't loud, but it was insistent, repeating in a pattern that made my skin crawl. I got up without really deciding to, moving slowly, carefully, as if any sudden motion might draw attention. The cabin was darker now, but there were points of light inside. Small fires, flickering and uneven, casting shadows that slid across the walls. I peered through a cracked window, just wide enough to see in. Inside, figures moved in a slow circle. There were more of them than I'd expected, their faces lit briefly as they passed the fires, then swallowed by shadow again. Their eyes caught the light every time, reflecting it in a way that didn't look natural. They weren't looking at each other. They were all focused on something in the center of the room, something I couldn't see from my angle. The chanting grew clearer then. Low voices, overlapping, repeating phrases that felt heavy, like they carried meaning I wasn't meant to understand. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, to turn around and put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. But I didn't. Curiosity pinned me there, rooted my feet to the forest floor. It felt less like a choice and more like a failure of will, like something had reached inside me and held on. One of the figures stopped. Slowly, deliberately, their head turned, not toward the window, but directly at me. I couldn't see their full face, but I knew, with a certainty that still makes my stomach drop, that they could see me. Not just my body, but everything underneath it. The chanting didn't stop. The others kept moving, kept circling, as if this interruption was expected. I don't remember how I got back to my camp. I only know that I did, hands shaking, breath shallow, heart still racing. I didn't sleep. I sat there until dawn, listening to the chanting fade sometime in the night, replaced by that same unnatural silence. When morning finally came, the relief felt thin and fragile, like it could tear at any moment. I told myself I needed proof, that exhaustion and fear had twisted what I'd seen into something worse than it was. So I went back in daylight. The forest looked normal again, birds calling, sunlight filtering through leaves, the ground exactly as it should be. When I reached the hollow where the cabin had been, my legs nearly gave out. There was nothing there. No cabin, no foundation, no disturbed earth. The trees stood undisturbed, the leaves untouched, as if nothing had ever occupied that space. I walked the perimeter again and again, searching for any sign I hadn't imagined at all. There was nothing. No symbols, no ash, no footprints. just forest. I left immediately. I didn't explore further. I didn't stop to think. I hiked until my legs ached and my lungs burned, until I reached my car and locked the doors behind me like that might somehow keep the memory out. That was years ago. I still don't know what I saw. A cult, a hallucination, something else entirely. But I know the fear was real. I know the way those eyes felt when they settled on me, not with surprise or anger, but with recognition, as if I had wandered into something that existed whether I believed in it or not. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that hollow in the woods, about how easily the cabin vanished, and I wonder how many places like that exist. Structures that aren't meant to last, rituals that don't require witnesses, eyes that don't need light to see you. The memory hasn't faded. It sits with me, quiet and patient, like it's waiting for the day I wander too far off the map again. The fog came in faster than I expected, the way mountain weather does when it decides you've overstayed your welcome. One moment, I could still see the ridge stretching ahead of me, gray rock and bare-limbed trees rolling into the distance, and the next, it was like someone had pulled a curtain across the world. The trail vanished beneath my boots, swallowed by a thick, milky haze that muted sound and flattened everything into vague shapes. I stopped walking, heart already ticking faster, listening to the damp quiet settle around me. I'd been hiking Appalachian ridges my whole life. Fog wasn't new to me, but this felt different. It wasn't just low visibility. It was weight. The air clung to my skin and clothes, cold and wet, seeping into my bones until my fingers started to ache. The trees around me became tall, crooked silhouettes, their branches stretching out of the mist like grasping hands. Every direction looked the same, forward, back, left, right, just pale gray and darker shadows beyond it. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that panic was how people made mistakes out here. I took a few careful steps forward, testing the ground with my boot, when I heard it. A footstep, soft, almost polite. I froze, listening. A second step followed, then a third, each one falling just a fraction of a second after my own, as if someone were matching my pace exactly. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding wrong, muffled and swallowed by the fog before it could travel far. "Anyone out there?" No answer. Just another step. Heavier this time. Closer. I told myself it had to be another hiker. Someone else caught out by the fog. Maybe too shy or too startled to respond. But that explanation didn't sit right. I'd stopped moving and the footsteps hadn't. They circled slightly, crunching softly on wet leaves and gravel, never fully revealing their source. The sound raised the fine hairs on my arms, that deep instinctive warning that doesn't bother with logic. Then the chanting started. At first, it was so faint I thought it was the wind moving through the trees, some strange echo twisting sound back on itself, but it had rhythm, pattern, low voices rising and falling together, carried unevenly by the fog. The words didn't register as language, just sound shaped by human mouths. My chest tightened. The footsteps behind me stopped, replaced by stillness so complete it rang in my ears. I turned slowly, trying to see through the haze. Nothing, just trees fading into gray. The chanting grew clearer, drifting from downhill, pulling at my attention like a current. Against every sensible instinct I had, I followed it. The trail was gone now, but the ground sloped gently, and I moved with careful steps, afraid of tripping, more afraid of losing the sound and being alone with the fog again. The trees thinned abruptly, and I stumbled into a clearing I knew hadn't been on any map. The fog hung lower here, pooling near the ground, but in the center of the clearing it opened just enough for me to see them. Figures stood in a wide circle, draped in dark robes that absorbed the weak light filtering through the mist. They moved slowly, deliberately, each step synchronized, their heads bowed slightly as they chanted. In the center was a low stone structure, an altar, for lack of a better word, rough and uneven, as if it had been assembled from whatever rock was available. Dark stains marked its surface, old and deeply set. I couldn't move. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't some reenactment or performance. There were no lanterns, no modern gear, no signs of a campsite. Just people, if that's what they were, standing in the fog like they'd grown out of the mountain itself. The chanting vibrated through the clearing, felt more than heard, a dull pressure behind my eyes. One of them noticed me. The chant faltered, then stopped entirely, like a cord being cut. Every head lifted at once. Faces remained hidden beneath hoods, but I could feel their attention slam into me. It was overwhelming. The way being stared at by too many eyes is overwhelming. Even when you can't see them, the fog seemed to thicken, closing in around us, muting the world into a narrow, unreal space. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was absolute. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. I was not supposed to be there. This wasn't a place meant to be stumbled into, and I wasn't meant to witness whatever they were doing. The realization hit me with physical force, stealing the air from my lungs. My hands shook, and my legs felt weak, but instinct finally overpowered fear. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran uphill, away from the clearing, away from the stone altar and the watching figures. Branches whipped my face. Roots caught my boots. I fell once, hard, scraping my palms raw, but I didn't stop. Behind me, the chanting started again, louder this time, carried by the fog and stretched thin by distance. It followed me, echoing between the trees, threading through my thoughts until I couldn't tell if I was hearing it or remembering it. The fog thickened as I ran, reducing the world to a few feet in every direction. My breathing came in sharp, panicked bursts, lungs burning with cold air. I expected footsteps behind me again, heavy and relentless, but there were none. That was almost worse. The absence of pursuit felt deliberate, like they knew exactly where I was going and didn't need to hurry. Time lost meaning. I don't know how long I ran, minutes, maybe longer, until the fog began to thin. The gray light brightened, shadows sharpening into real shapes again. I burst out onto a section of trail I recognized, nearly collapsing with relief. I didn't stop until I was well clear of the ridge, until the fog was nothing but a distant smear clinging to the higher elevations. I made it back to my car in a state of numb shock, hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. Even as I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see dark shapes standing at the edge of the road, watching me go. There was nothing, just trees and empty pavement. I told myself it had been stress, exhaustion, the fog playing tricks on my senses. I repeated that explanation until it lost meaning, but no explanation could erase the memory of that clearing, the stone altar, the way they all stopped and looked at me as if my presence had been anticipated. Even now, years later, fog unsettles me in a way it never did before. When it rolls in thick and quiet, muffling the world and bending sound. I find myself listening for chanting I hope I'll never hear again. I avoid that ridge. I avoid any trail that climbs too high, where weather can turn without warning and the world can disappear around you. Because somewhere in those mountains, there are clearings that don't want to be found. And when the fog comes in just right, it doesn't just hide the trail, it hides the line between what you're meant to see and what was never meant to notice you at all. I took the detour because I thought it would save me time, and because I was tired enough to trust a road I shouldn't have. Night had already settled deep into the mountains, the kind of Appalachian dark that feels layered, as if shadows stack on top of each other until depth itself disappears. My cabin sat miles away down a winding stretch of gravel, and the main road would have taken me nearly an hour longer. The map showed an old crossroads cutting through the woods, barely more than a thin line. I remembered locals mentioning it once, years ago, always with a shrug and a quick change of subject. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. The moon was low, hanging just above the ridgeline, swollen and yellow, casting long, warped shadows across the road. Trees leaned inward as I drove, their branches arching overhead like ribs. The gravel thinned, then gave way to packed dirt, my headlights catching dust that hung in the air longer than it should have. There were no houses, no fences, no signs of recent traffic, just forest, dense, watchful. When I reached the crossroads, I slowed instinctively. It wasn't marked by any sign, just two narrow roads intersecting at an awkward angle, the ground worn smooth by age rather than use. That's when I saw the candles. Small flames flickered in a loose circle just off the road, their light trembling against the darkness. At first, I thought it might be a memorial. People do that sometimes, even out here. But then my headlights swept farther, and I saw the wooden stakes. They were crude things, driven into the ground at uneven heights, stripped of bark, their ends sharpened roughly. Some had scraps of cloth tied around them, dark and stiff, fluttering faintly in the night air. My foot eased off the accelerator, heart beginning to thud harder than it should have. Then I saw the figures. They moved slowly, deliberately, emerging from the shadows one by one. They were more than I could count at first glance, their bodies half hidden by the trees. They wore dark clothing that swallowed what little light there was, and they walked in a wide circle around the stakes and candles. Their heads were bowed, and their mouths moved in time with one another, chanting under their breath. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm carried, low and steady, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I pulled off the road without really deciding to, killing the engine before it could betray me. The sudden silence was deafening. I slipped out of the truck and crouched behind a thick oak, every muscle tight, breath shallow. The cold seeped through my jacket, but sweat prickled along my spine. From where I hid, I could see the crossroads clearly. The candles cast just enough light to catch flashes of faces as the figures passed through it. Pale skin, hollow eyes, expressions fixed in something between focus and absence. The chanting grew louder, not in volume, but in presence. I could feel it pressing against my chest, vibrating through bone and muscle, syncing my heartbeat to its rhythm whether I wanted it to or not. It was hard to think clearly. The night seemed to narrow, closing in around that circle until nothing else mattered. I had the overwhelming sense that this place wasn't just a crossroads of roads, but of something else, something older, heavier. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to ease the ache in my legs, and a small stone rolled beneath my boot. The sound was tiny, barely more than a whisper, but it might as well have been a shout. The chanting faltered. One by one, the figures slowed, then stopped. The circle broke its motion, freezing in place. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then one of them lifted their head. Slowly, deliberately, they raised an arm and pointed directly at me. There was no hesitation, no searching glance, just certainty. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember deciding to run. 1 second I was crouched behind that tree, and the next I was sprinting blindly into the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, roots grabbing at my feet. Behind me, the chanting resumed. Louder now. Faster. The rhythm accelerating until it felt like it might tear my chest apart. I ran without direction, guided only by panic and the faint hope that downhill would eventually lead somewhere familiar. My lungs burned, every breath sharp and cold, I stumbled more than once, catching myself on trees, barely avoiding a fall that might have ended everything. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sense of being followed was overwhelming, even though I never heard footsteps. It felt as if the woods themselves were leaning in, guiding me where they wanted me to go. At some point, the ground evened out, and I recognized the slope leading back toward my cabin. Relief surged through me so hard it nearly made me collapse. I burst into the clearing, porch light a weak but welcome beacon, and fumbled with the door until it finally swung open. I slammed it shut behind me and threw the bolt, leaning against the wood as if my weight alone could keep the outside out. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, the familiar smell of old pine and smoke doing little to calm my nerve. My hands shook uncontrollably. I listened. At first, there was nothing, just my own ragged breathing and the slow creak of the cabin settling. Then I felt it, not a sound, not exactly. A presence, like pressure at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I moved to the window, careful not to let my silhouette show. The woods beyond were still, too still. Shadows pooled unnaturally between the trees, thicker than the darkness elsewhere. I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched, of eyes fixed on the cabin, patient and unblinking. The chanting was gone, but the rhythm lingered, echoing faintly in my chest as if it had sunk into me and refused to leave. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back to the wall, shotgun across my lap, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind. Nothing came closer, nothing announced itself, but the presence never fully lifted. It hovered at the edge of perception until dawn finally bled gray into the sky. When morning came, I went outside. The woods looked ordinary again. Birds called, leaves stirred. There were no footprints, no candles, no stakes. If I hadn't known where to look, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined it all, but I did know, and I never took that detour again. Even now, years later, I avoid crossroads after dark. Some nights, when the moon hangs low and shadows stretch too long across the ground, I feel that same pressure in my chest. That same rhythm trying to sink itself to my heartbeat, and I know, with a certainty that still makes my skin crawl, that whatever I interrupted that night didn't forget me. It's still out there, waiting at the edge of the woods, patient enough to let time do the work. I'd wandered into that hollow the way I'd wandered into so many others over the years, following a deer trail that wasn't marked on any map, trusting my sense of direction more than I should have. It was late afternoon, the light already slanting low through the trees, turning the forest floor into a patchwork of shadow and dull gold. This part of Appalachia was rarely traveled, the kind of place locals avoided without ever explaining why. The trees grew closer together there, their trunks thick and old, roots twisting over one another like they had been fighting for space for a long time. That was when I noticed the smoke. At first, it was just a thin gray ribbon curling lazily through the trees, so faint I thought it might be mist lifting off damp ground. Then I caught the smell, sharp, bitter, not quite like wood smoke. My first thought was a campfire. Someone else out here, maybe another hiker who'd gotten an early start on the evening. Still, something about the way the smoke moved made me uneasy. It didn't rise straight up or drift with the breeze. It coiled, folding back on itself, lingering longer than it should have. I moved closer, slow and careful, placing each foot deliberately to avoid snapping twigs. The forest grew quieter with every step, the usual sounds thinning until all I could hear was my own breathing and the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. When I reached the edge of a small clearing, I stopped so abruptly my legs nearly buckled. There were figures gathered around a shallow pit in the center of the clearing, hooded, every one of them, their shapes dark against the orange glow of the fire. The flames licked upward in uneven bursts, illuminating their faces just enough to tell me I didn't want to see them clearly. They stood in a loose circle, bodies swaying slightly as they chanted in low, overlapping voices. The words didn't register as language, but the cadence was wrong, too steady, too intentional. It made my stomach twist, like my body understood the danger before my mind caught up. Something burned in the pit, though I couldn't see what it was. The flames clung to it unnaturally, flaring and dimming in slow pulses. Every time the fire brightened, the chanting grew louder, more insistent, as if the two were connected. My legs felt heavy, like they'd sunk into the ground. Fear told me to turn around and leave, to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. But fascination held me there, a sick, magnetic pull that made it hard to look away. I took a step closer without meaning to, then another. A branch cracked under my boot, sharp and loud in the unnatural quiet. The chanting stopped instantly. Not one voice lingering, not one movement out of sync. Every head turned toward me at once. I ducked behind the nearest tree, pressing my back against the rough bark, heart slamming so hard I was sure they could hear it. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe slowly, shallowly. From where I stood, I could still see part of the clearing. The figures hadn't moved closer. They just stood there, facing my direction, motionless. Even with their faces hidden, I felt their attention like a physical weight, pinning me in place. The smoke began to change. It thickened, darkening as it rose from the pit, no longer drifting randomly. It twisted into shapes that made my head swim, long, stretched forms that almost looked like arms, then faces, then nothing at all. The air grew heavy and hot, carrying a smell that made my eyes water and my throat tighten. It wasn't wood. It wasn't anything natural. It was sweet and foul at the same time, like something living reduced to ash. The figures resumed chanting, slower now, deeper, their voices vibrating through the ground. I felt it in my teeth, in my ribs, in the back of my skull. For a terrifying moment, I wondered if they knew exactly where I was, if hiding was just part of whatever ritual they were performing. I thought about running, but the idea of turning my back on that clearing filled me with a paralyzing dread. I was convinced that if I moved too soon, I wouldn't make it 10 steps. Then, without warning, a gust of wind tore through the hollow. It came hard and sudden, bending branches as it's scattering leaves in a violent rush. The fire sputtered, flared once, and went out. Darkness swallowed the clearing. The chanting cut off mid-syllable, as abrupt as if someone had closed a door. For a few seconds, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I waited, muscles screaming with tension, eyes straining to adjust. Slowly, shapes emerged again as my vision caught up. The pit was there, nothing but glowing embers now, but the figures were gone, not retreating, not fading into the trees. Gone. I stayed where I was far longer than made sense, afraid to step out from behind that tree. When I finally forced myself to move, my legs trembled so badly I had to brace myself. I approached the pit cautiously, every instinct screaming at me not to get closer. The ground around it was disturbed, churned up by many feet, but there were no clear footprints leading away, just ash, scattered and cold, and that lingering, awful smell that clung to my clothes and hair. I didn't search for answers. I didn't linger. I turned and left the hollow as fast as I could without breaking into a full run, afraid that sudden movement might draw attention I couldn't see. The forest slowly came back to life as I put distance between myself and that clearing. Birds called. Wind moved through the leaves. The world stitched itself back together, but I didn't feel relief. I felt watched. Even now, years later, that image stays with me. The way the smoke twisted, the way the chanting stopped all at once, the certainty that those faceless gazes had lingered on me longer than I could see them. I still hike, but I avoid the hollows, especially the ones that feel too quiet, too closed in. And sometimes, when I catch the faint smell of smoke where there shouldn't be any, my chest tightens and my legs go heavy all over again. I don't know what they were burning. I don't know who those figures were or where they went when the fire died. All I know is that something happened in that hollow that wasn't meant to be witnessed. And even though I left it behind, I have the uneasy sense that some part of it followed me out, silent and patient, waiting for the next time I wander too far off the path. I set up camp on that ridge because it was close to an old logging trail I'd been following all day, one of those forgotten cuts through the Appalachians where the trees have mostly reclaimed what was taken from them. The trail was barely visible anymore, just a depression in the earth and the occasional rusted cable half buried under leaves. It felt remote in the way I liked, quiet, isolated, far from roads or towns. I remember thinking it was the kind of place where nothing could find you unless it was already looking. Night fell hard and cold. The wind moved gently through the trees, enough to make the branches sigh and creak, but not enough to be unsettling. I ate, crawled into my sleeping bag, and let exhaustion pull me under. I don't know how long I slept before the sound woke me. At first, it barely registered, slipping into my dreams like background noise. A low, drawn-out sound, almost like mourning carried on the wind. I lay still, listening, trying to decide if it was real or just the forest settling. The longer I listened, the more wrong it felt. The sound wasn't random. It rose and fell together, multiple voices blending into something unified. It wasn't wind, it was people. I sat up slowly, heart beginning to pound, careful not to make noise. The air outside the tent felt heavier than it had earlier, thick and damp despite the cold. The voices grew clearer as my senses sharpened. Soft at first, then gathering weight, forming a chant that made my scalp prickle. The words weren't clear, but the rhythm was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Each rise and fall pressed against my thoughts, making it hard to focus on anything else. I told myself I should stay put. Whatever it was, getting closer wasn't smart. But curiosity mixed with a creeping dread pushed me to act. I eased out of my tent, boots in hand, moving as quietly as I could across the leaf-covered ground. The chanting seemed to come from uphill, beyond a small rise I hadn't explored. Every step felt like a mistake I couldn't take back. When I reached the crest of the hill, I lowered myself to the ground and peered over. Below me was a clearing I hadn't seen in daylight, a shallow bowl carved into the ridge. In the center was a pit, maybe 6 or 7 feet across, dug into the earth. Around it stood figures, at least a dozen of them, arranged in a rough circle. They swayed slowly, back and forth, as if guided by the same unseen hand. Each held a torch, the flames casting jittery light across their faces and bodies. The shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching long and thin across the ground, merging together until it was hard to tell where one person ended and another began. The chanting was louder now, close enough that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. It drowned out my own thoughts, reduced them to fragments. The pit itself seemed wrong. The darkness inside it wasn't just an absence of light. It felt dense, almost fluid. As the chanting intensified, the darkness pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat. Every pulse sent a wave of unease through me, a deep, instinctive warning that whatever was happening there was not meant to be seen. I slid back and crawled behind a fallen log, pressing myself into the dirt. From there, I could still see the clearing through gaps in the branches. The figures continued their rhythmic motion, heads bowed, faces slack with something that looked disturbingly like devotion. They didn't speak individually. Their voices merged into a single sound, rising and falling together, steady and relentless. Time lost its meaning. The chanting went on and on, each repetition tightening the knot in my stomach. My muscles ached from staying still, but I didn't dare move. Every now and then, one of the figures would step closer to the pit, lowering their torch toward the darkness, as if offering it something. The flames never touched the bottom. They stopped short, hovering, as though an invisible boundary held them back. The longer I watched, the more unreal it felt. The world outside that clearing seemed distant, like a memory. All that existed was the pit, the chanting, the slow sway of bodies moving in perfect, unsettling synchronization. I felt stripped down to something small and fragile, an intruder in a place where I had no protection. At some point, the chanting shifted. It dropped lower, slower, the rhythm stretching out. The pulsing from the pit grew more pronounced, sending a dull pressure through the ground. My teeth buzzed. My head felt light, like I might pass out. I had the sudden, terrifying thought that if it went on much longer, I wouldn't be able to leave. That whatever was happening would pull me in, erase the part of me that knew to be afraid. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't the natural quiet of the woods. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had thickened. The figures stood motionless for several seconds, torches held steady, heads still bowed. Then, one by one, they turned away from the pit and began to disperse. No words were exchanged, no signals given. They simply walked into the surrounding forest, slipping between the trees until they vanished completely. The torches went with them, their light swallowed by the darkness. The pit lay empty, its pulsing fading until it was nothing more than a dark hole in the ground. I waited, barely breathing, listening for footsteps, for voices, for any sign they were still nearby. Nothing came. Eventually, I forced myself to move. My legs trembled as I stood, every nerve screaming at me to leave. I didn't go down into the clearing. I didn't look into the pit. I turned and retreated the way I'd come, moving as quietly and quickly as I could manage. When I reached my tent, I packed it up in the dark, hands shaking so badly I dropped things more than once. I didn't sleep again that night. I hiked out before dawn, the logging trail stretching ahead of me like an escape route I didn't trust. The forest looked normal in the early light, peaceful even. But the feeling didn't leave me. For days afterward, that silence clung to me. Not the absence of sound, but that oppressive stillness I'd felt after the chanting stopped. It settled into my bones, followed me into sleep, lingered in quiet rooms. Sometimes, in the moments just before drifting off, I thought I could feel a faint pulse beneath everything, slow and steady, like something waiting. I don't camp near old logging trails anymore, and I don't climb ridges at night. Some places hold on to what happens there, long after the people are gone. And once you've heard that kind of chanting, once you've felt that kind of silence, you never really leave it behind. I was driving late along Hollow Creek because it was the fastest way home, not the safest. That road cuts deep through a stretch of Appalachia most people avoid after dark, winding alongside the creek so closely in places that your headlights catch water instead of ground. I'd driven it plenty of times during the day, but at night it felt like a different place entirely. The trees leaned inward, branches knitting together overhead, blocking out what little moonlight there was. My radio kept losing signal, fading into static no matter how many times I adjusted it. So eventually I shut it off and let the silence fill the cab. That was when I noticed the lights. At first, I thought it was just fireflies, or maybe reflections off the water, but the glow was too steady, too deliberate. Flickers of orange danced between the trees on the far side of the creek, moving in a way that didn't match the sway of branches or the current of the water. I slowed down, leaning forward in my seat, squinting through the windshield. My first thought was that someone might be stranded. Campers, maybe, or kids who'd gotten lost. Against my better judgment, I pulled onto the shoulder and cut the headlights, letting the engine idle quietly. The moment the lights dimmed, the forest felt closer. I rolled down my window just a crack. The air outside was thick and damp, carrying the smell of water and something else beneath it. Sharp, bitter, almost sweet. Burning herbs. It hit the back of my throat and made my eyes sting. That's when I saw them clearly. Down in the creek bed, where the water widened and slowed, a group of hooded figures stood in a loose circle. They were positioned with careful symmetry, each one facing inward toward a small fire burning on a flat stretch of rock. The creek reflected the flames, turning the water into a trembling ribbon of orange and black. Smoke drifted upward in slow, curling tendrils, clinging low to the ground instead of dispersing. The figures moved together, swaying slightly, their motions so synchronized it looked rehearsed. Practiced. They were chanting. The sound was faint through the glass and distance, but it carried a rhythm that settled deep in my chest. Low voices, layered and steady, rising and falling in a pattern that felt older than the road I was parked on. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The cadence alone was enough to make my hands tighten on the steering wheel. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, like something tapping gently but endlessly at the inside of your skull. I told myself I should leave. That stopping had been a mistake. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the window control and rolled the glass back up, trying to keep the sound and smell out. The chanting continued, unbroken, the figures' heads bowed, their attention fixed on the fire and the creek below. I eased my foot onto the accelerator, just enough to get the car moving without revving the engine. That's when it happened. Every single one of them stopped moving at the exact same moment. The chanting cut off mid-breath, plunging the creek bed into a silence so sudden it made my ears ring. One by one, heads lifted beneath their hoods. And then, as if guided by a single thought, they all turned toward the road. Toward me. I don't know how they knew I was there. My headlights were off. The engine was barely louder than a whisper, but I felt it immediately. That awful, sinking certainty that I'd been noticed. Even from that distance, I could feel their attention lock onto my car like a physical force. My chest tightened, breath catching in my throat. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The fire crackled softly. Water murmured over stones, and the forest seemed to lean in. Then the chanting started again. It was louder now, faster, the rhythm tightening, pushing against my ribs until my heartbeat stuttered to keep up. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I slammed my foot down, gravel spraying as the car lurched forward. The headlights snapped on, briefly illuminating the trees, the creek, the edge of that circle. But I didn't look long enough to see if they'd moved. I sped down Hollow Creek Road, taking turns too fast, tires skidding on damp pavement. My hands shook so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. Every instinct screamed at me not to look in the mirror, but I couldn't help it. I glanced once, just a flicker of a second, half expecting to see figures standing at the edge of the road, watching me flee. There was nothing, just darkness and the pale ribbon of road vanishing behind me. I didn't slow down until the trees thinned and the road widened, until I reached a stretch where houses dotted the hillsides and porch lights glowed faintly in the distance. Only then did I realize how hard I was breathing, how soaked my shirt was with sweat despite the cold. I pulled over and sat there, engine running, staring straight ahead, afraid that if I stopped completely, whatever tension was holding me together would snap. I made it home that night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures moving in perfect unison, firelight reflecting off the creek, smoke curling low and heavy around their feet. I could still smell the herbs, feel that rhythm pressing against my chest. For days afterward, I jumped at every shadow, every unexpected sound. Driving at night became something I dreaded instead of enjoyed. I went back once, weeks later during the day. I told myself I needed closure, needed to see that place in the light to prove it had been nothing more than people doing something strange but harmless. Hollow Creek looked ordinary enough then. Clear water, mossy rocks. No signs of fire, no footprints, no burned patches where a ritual might have taken place. If I hadn't known exactly where to look, I would have driven right past without a second thought, but knowing didn't help. Even now, years later, I avoid that road after dark. When I have no choice and find myself driving near running water at night, I turn the radio up loud, anything to drown out the silence. Because sometimes, when the night is still and the trees press in close, I swear I can hear it again. That low, steady chant drifting just beyond the edge of the headlights, patient and waiting, like it knows I remember.